So, recording is started. Thank you, anybody chiming in now, and anybody who's checking back in on the upload later. But today we're continuing a discussion of To Have a Center by Fridtjof Schuon. And the second half of this book, I gotta say, was not easy. Pretty difficult, very, very esoteric, and altogether, I don't know how much, personally useful type of stuff there is to extract from this. But I'm still going to try my best to try and parse through some of the stuff that I found interesting or particularly relevant. So he starts off continuing with this ontology chapter, and he has a bit of a thing on the demiurge. And now I was not... I've heard this phrase before, demiurge, and what exactly this means. But it's not something I could explain to you in clear language, and I would say honestly, it's probably not something I could explain in clear language now, but I'll do my best. So the demiurge is essentially an entity that is below God, but not necessarily with or against him. So in some theologies, the demiurge is the creator of the world, who is a different person from God, or a different being than God. So God is above this demiurge, and the demiurge is below him and created the earth, and is not inherently friendly or hostile. And that is why there's sometimes a conflict on earth between the way things are and the things that are most appealing to God. So there's this contention between God and the demiurge. Now, as far as the Catholic viewpoint on this, I think that they say God and the Creator are the same person. So oftentimes this demiurge figure is actually given to Satan. So Satan, or Lucifer, is this demiurge, this all evil type of character that is going to cause man to be led astray from God. Whereas in other theologies, you have this creator demiurge, who is not necessarily pure evil, but just in contention with the actual supreme creator. So it's a pretty complex concept. But Satan as the demiurge and Satan as the one leading us astray, I think that's probably the most common way of seeing evil and seeing this conception of a demiurge. And what exactly he had to say about that was once again very, very hard to parse. In fact, I don't really know how much beyond that I can go, because he basically just describes the devil as the demiurge, and how it's he was working for God, in the service of God, before he had this personal fall, and then he leads man to his own fall. Right, so it's sort of a reflection of Satan in what we see in man. But ultimately, again, I don't know how useful that is. I don't know how much you people don't already understand that. And there was a lot of things like that, because he has a whole chapter on spiritual perspectives, which includes degrees and dimensions of theism, and he kind of goes into monotheism versus polytheism versus polyentheism, which is another one I believe. And it's kind of stuff like, I think it's interesting, but not really all that useful to us, And then he has a whole chapter on David, Shankara, and Honen. And now, as a person who's not really into Shintoism or Hinduism, I have no idea who Shankara or Honen are. And so a lot of the things that he said were not all that useful to me as well either. But it was interesting in how he talked about David in contrast to these other two. And there was actually a pretty interesting quote that he brought up in regards to that. So as far as David, Shankar, and Honen, he says that they each have a different way of connecting with God, which is actually quite interesting. So the three ways are way of altogether human prayer, the way of metaphysical discernment, the way of saving trust, and the three ways can be combined because man has several chords in his soul, or in other words, because human subjectivity comprises different sectors. It is true that prayer and trust pertain to the same sector, but such is not the case with metaphysical discernment, whose subject is not the sensible soul, but pure intelligence, something which, far from creating an antagonism, permits the simultaneity of parallel approaches. The proof of this is the altogether lyrical piety of a Shankara, his hymns and invocations to the feminine as well as masculine aspects of the transcendent and immanent divinity, to the self who a priori is infinitely other, and who in reality is infinitely ourselves. So towards the end there, once again, it kind of goes a little into the highly esoteric, but just at the very beginning when he's talking about prayer versus discernment versus trust, I think this is kind of an interesting, I guess you'd say, trichotomy, or differentiating these three things. So he said David was the path of prayer, as you can see through, all of his psalms, and he connected through God in that way. Versus then he goes into this Shankara, who I assume was some Hindu figure, Hindu scholar or monk, and he had this way of discernment, which is more focus, right? You're trying to meditate and focus on this idea of God, which is totally different. Well, not totally different, but has a difference from prayer, right? Whereas prayer, you're actually trying to communicate with God and receive some type of message, as opposed to this meditation on this idea of God as a being, right? And then lastly, in the Shintoism of Honen, he talks about trust, and he says that trust and prayer are very similar, but trust in the sense that you just hand yourself over to God and not necessarily attempting to communicate in a certain way. So yeah, pretty interesting differentiation there, and I'm sure you could go a lot deeper into that, but once again, I don't know how well equipped I am to go take a really deep dive into that, considering I don't know all that much about Hinduism or Shintoism. But it is interesting to even talk about Shintoism, because I think most types of theologians, right, they kind of just talk about Western versus Eastern religion, but when it comes to Western, they only talk about Christianity, and when it comes to Eastern, they will only talk about Buddhism or Hinduism. And from what I understand, Shintoism is not like either of those. Well, it has elements of either of those, but is not the same. It's definitely different. And then there's this last summarizing chapter on fundamental keys, and there was a good quote from here. It said, "Correlative to this attitude or virtue, there is the compensating attitude of trust. Whoso puts his trust in God while conforming to the divine demands will find God altogether disposed to come to his aid. But what we respect from heaven we must ourselves offer to others. Whoso desires mercy for himself must himself be merciful." So this was an interesting idea of prayer and what people are actually searching for through God and religion. It has this kind of mutual benefit. Oh, I don't want to say mutual benefit, but you need to give something in order to receive something. So you can't just keep asking for God. You also need to give to the world, right? So he says, what we expect from heaven, we must offer ourselves to others. So if you want to seek help from providence, you also need to be a provider, which I think is a pretty interesting and a good way to think about your life, right? You don't want to be constantly taking, you want to be providing something to other people. Siddhartha says, I've seen some modern Catholic thinkers write about the Trinity in a way pretty similar to the trust, prayer, intellect system, actually. 3 realms of being. Yeah, and I think you totally could say prayer to God, and then I would say trust in Jesus, and intellect in the Holy Spirit. I would say that that's probably where they're going. I could be totally wrong with that, but yeah, and speaking of this, I also wanted to talk a little bit about mysteries, and he kind of talks about holy mysteries in the Catholicism, and I think that he sort of contradicts himself too, because he sort of says that there's some issues in the fact that these mysteries beg the question, and they sort of are not entirely rational. And but before that, he talks about gnosis and supra-rational thinking. So I don't know, some of the things he says, I'm not sure if it's totally coherent, because he'll say one thing and then somewhat contradict it in the next chapter. And so that was just one thing I saw that I didn't think was, I didn't like that very much. And then he had another thing that was interesting when he talked about worship of Mary. So there's this long-standing Orthodox versus Catholic dispute about Catholics supposedly worshiping Mary, which is wrong in the eyes of the Orthodox, who say that you can only worship God. And then Catholics also say that they don't actually worship Mary. They ask Mary to pray for us, right? So when you pray to Mary, right, when you do the Hail Mary, it's pray for us sinners now at the hour of our death, as opposed to praying to Mary as a deity. You pray to her as you would to a saint and ask for them to pray for you on your behalf, right? So it is a complex thing, but he also makes a kind of a good point where he says even if the Catholics were worshiping Mary, that is sort of justified, because if you look at Jesus, right? Jesus was this supreme being turned into flesh, but was also given birth out of the flesh of a woman. So the body of the divine Christ was composed of Mary's flesh, right? If she was the mother of God. So therefore, if you're saying the person, Jesus, who is the manifestation of God, has the flesh of Mary, does that not mean that there has to be some divine aspect to Mary's flesh? So that was kind of an interesting thought that he had there, and I don't know how much further I could expand on that, without being a theologian, but it was at least interesting to think about, and a different take on that dispute that I have not really heard before. And then the final chapter was just called Various Subjects, and it was, I don't know, I would say especially not useful. He has a whole chapter on translating, which kind of just says more of, the very obvious things for anybody who is a translator. He's like, oh, well, you need to keep the true idea of something, even if it is less clear, right? So any kind of translational changes you make, to make something more clear, or any kind of idioms that you might change, is not going to be that's not good. You should retain the basic, the very basic text. You should translate the text as literal as possible while keeping the meaning intact, and not change anything for a different audience, which is like very obvious. I mean, I think that anybody who is a translator could probably tell you the exact same thing themselves. While not many of them, many of them are going to not do that, I would say very many of them think that you should do that. And then he has like a marginally interesting chapter on vestimentary art. So just means clothing. And I guess he does talk about, clothing does have a sort of spiritual dimension, and the type of clothes that you wear is going to have a certain effect on your identity. Such things as like priestly vestments, there is a sacrality to this, and as you don a certain vestment, you are taking on a certain role, and that role could be even something as simple as, you put on the uniform of a doctor, that has some symbolic meaning to it, whether or not you are a doctor, right? Which is why, even in a legal sense, you can't impersonate a doctor, you can't impersonate a police officer, because just in this symbolic clothing, there is true meaning there. But then he goes on about like Native American headdresses and like the meaning of this, which is like, interesting. But once again, he kind of goes on this like whole like defense of like the Native Americans, and importance of their spiritual culture, which is, maybe you're into that stuff, but personally, I don't know how much there is that we could extract from studying Native American theology in a very deep way, right? I mean, it could be interesting at a surface level, but altogether, I just don't know why he has to go on this very long-winded defense of Native American religion in a chapter that's supposed to be about clothing. It was kind of a tangent, if you will. And then, lastly, he had a chapter about astronomy. And this is kind of interesting. He talks about heliocentric versus geocentric, and he talks about how the geocentric worldview, that the Earth is the center of the universe, is not inherently wrong in a sort of metaphorical sense, right? Because you can understand that the true physical truth is that the Earth revolves around the sun, but from like a personal visual standpoint in which you understand about the world, just observing it, you see the sun revolve around the Earth. So both can simultaneously be true in different dimensions. And as a physicist, this is actually something I have talked about in class with the students. It's like, is the Earth flat? Well, no, the Earth is not flat, but in certain situations, in fact, almost every single situation, you can make the approximation that it is. So for all intents and purposes, yes, the Earth is flat, right? You don't need to take into account spherical geometry when you do any type of immediate type of math problem, right? And you do if you're doing, very large scale problems, but for anything that you would want to do on Earth, you really don't have to take any of that into account, right? You don't have to take into account the spherical geometric aspect. You can just treat the Earth as a flat plane. So in anything that would be relevant to you, you could more or less say the Earth is flat. So these things can be true in different ways. So the Earth is not literally flat, but conceptually, yes. The Earth does not, or the sun does not revolve around the Earth, but conceptually, yes, it can. Funky says, native religion consists of creating new tortillas to eat around a campfire. Wow, man, I think Shuan would have a lot to say about that. I think he would be very triggered. That was the last chapter. Ultimately, as Siddhartha said, it's very academic, so not exactly useful. Right, but once again, what academic is reading this? This is kind of fringe stuff to the point where I'm not saying that it shouldn't exist or that it's not a good piece of work. It's just, as a non-academic, I think that, I don't know, you want stuff that's going to, change your perspectives, open your eyes, and I think that this was kind of a bit too esoteric to really do that at this point in time for me and probably most of us, right? Maybe if I was, more into esotericism and spent a lot of time studying this, maybe there would be some high-level insights here that I could extract. But as of now, not really all that much. And Casey says, this book was very piecemeal, and I feel like it could be an amazing book if only each chapter were tied together. Yeah, that's the other thing. It kind of started off with this really interesting premise of the genius and the idea of having a center that was totally abandoned. It was sort of a misnamed book because really none of this was about having a center besides the first one or two chapters. Evola and Ganon are more accessible, and this was written after them. Yeah, totally. And even as esoteric as Evola is, it's probably not even close to as esoteric as this. I think Metaphysics of War is something much easier to digest. And then Ganon is even more easy to digest than that. I think Ganon is probably the easiest perennialist, traditionalist writer. Siddhartha says, how long was your translation? Well, the one I used was about, it's hard to say because it is on Kindle. but I think converting it from a PDF, it was like 120 or something. I don't think what I read had the selected letters that you read. Interesting. Well, this was about 120 pages, and I don't know if there is any other version. But you also read it a while ago, so maybe you're misremembering. But yeah, I guess that's probably my final thoughts on Shuan. I don't know if anybody has anything that they'd like to add, but yeah, ultimately, not much else to say. I think I'm not going to say I didn't enjoy it. Well, I'm pretty lukewarm about the whole thing. I probably wouldn't recommend this to somebody who's, just trying to get into, perennialism or traditionalism. I would say this is definitely not my go-to recommendation for them. But maybe somewhere down the line it'll have its place. So yeah, if anybody wants to hop in, I'll leave the voice channel open for a sec. But otherwise, I will end it right there because I don't know what else more there is to say. And so yeah, if this is the end of the video, make sure like, subscribe, all that BS, and tell your friends, join the club, read some books, enjoy. Torturing the villagers for next week. Yeah, I think that looks like the clear winner. So yes, we will be discussing Francen's torturing the villagers, which should be a good one. Should be a bit more lighthearted, a little bit easier to digest than this one, that's for sure. So looking forward to it. And it looks like nobody's joined the voice, so I will probably end it right there, fellas. Thanks for stopping by.